Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're so glad to have everyone here tonight to celebrate Spirits of San Francisco, Voyages Through the Unknown City by Gary Kamiya and Paul Madonna. My name's Colleen. I lead our programming here at the Battery, and I'm really glad to welcome back Gary and welcome Paul tonight to do this virtual talk. Gary, I believe, spoke at the Battery previously on his first book, Cool Gray City of Love. And their new book, Spirits of San Francisco, is just released in October. If you're interested, Battery members have the opportunity to purchase an autographed copy through Booksmith, and we'll put a link in the chat. You just need to specify that you want a signed copy at checkout, and we'll send those notes as well. And then just a note for housekeeping, everyone's muted tonight, so we can avoid any errant background noise. Feel free to turn on your camera if you'd like. Otherwise, you can just sit back and listen along. We will be using the chat feature to interact with each other and for the Q&A. So if you have questions as they come up, feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll do a Q&A towards the end. And I'm really excited to welcome our moderator tonight, Kenneth Woon. Kenneth's a Battery member, and he sort of leads our unofficial history club. Thank you, Kenneth, for moderating tonight. And he's moderated events in the past and continues to be a great partner. So thank you again. And I'll hand it over to you, Kenneth.
All right. Hey, welcome, everyone. We're here to present the book Spirits of San Francisco right here. It's a fantastic book. And Paul and Gary, why don't you say a little bit about yourself, like a little bit about your background, just so folks know like sort of what you've done in your past kind of stuff.
Okay, Paul, you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Paul Madonna. I'm an artist and an author, primarily known for my series All Over Coffee, which ran in the San Francisco Chronicle from 2003 till 2015. I have 3 books with City Lights. 2 of them are collections of All Over Coffee. One is a novella, and I have 2 illustrated novels. Actually, one that came out right at the same time called Come to Light. That's at the same time as Gary and I are doing Spirits of San Francisco. Gary and I do the series Spirits of the City in the Nob Hill Gazette, which is where we did the groundwork for everything that's in this book.
All right, Gary.
Yeah, I'm Gary Kamiya. I'm a journalist and historian. I was one of the co-founders of Salon.com. And before that, I worked at The Examiner. And I was also the executive editor of San Francisco Magazine for about 5 years. So I've done a little bit of everything in journalism. And I sort of fell into San Francisco history after writing my second book, actually, Cool Gray City of Love, 49 Views of San Francisco, which just opened a lot of doors for me and just pushed me much more in the direction of writing about San Francisco, which is not something that I had focused on before. And I'm not an academic historian. I actually have an English major. But I just loved the history of San Francisco and began to immerse myself in it. And I've been doing it more and more. And that led to this collaboration with Paul, The Spirits of San Francisco, our new book.
Wow. All right. Hey, so for those of you, like, this book is a little different. It's not just history. It's not just art. It's almost like the best of both worlds. How would you describe what this book is?
Well, I'll take the first stab at that, Paul. Well, Paul and I wanted to do kind of a kaleidoscope of San Francisco, and one that would bring out the best of both of our takes on the city. And so we really consciously wanted to collaborate very closely, 50-50, with every decision about what we were going to choose. We wanted to be able to have it be great art that spoke to Paul's amazing visual sense, and choose sites that I could tell compelling stories about. And we also wanted to choose a really wide range of sites in San Francisco, everything from really famous, iconic places like the Palace of Fine Arts and the crooked part of Lombard Street, to really obscure things that probably almost no one even knows about. So basically the book's 16 chapters, 16 drawings, and each one of these chapters has anywhere from 5 to 10 or 12 vignettes, all different kinds of stories that I unearthed about these places, again, ranging from pretty well known, although I tried to always dig up something fresh, to really, really obscure pieces of information. So we wanted to just, have a really eccentric, wide-ranging, and very personal and artistic take on San Francisco.
Yeah, Paul, how did you end up picking like what to draw for each of these?
Well,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead,
sorry.
Paul. Yeah.
As Gary said, it was extremely collaborative. The whole thing, everything that we chose had to be approved by both of us. And what's interesting is that both Gary and I love San Francisco, and both of us are known for the work that we've done here. And I spent 12 years doing all over coffee and published over 800 drawings of San Francisco. And for me, there was a sense of, how do I get to see the city in a new way? How can I look at it differently? How can I give something new to an audience and make it exciting for me and exciting for them? And I think that's the challenge with a history book as well. Is, a place like San Francisco has so many infamous stories, so many legends, so many stories that are twisted and told and have truths. And I think that Gary and I were able to look through each other's lenses, so to speak. And we would go out driving together, and it's actually so much fun because we'd be driving around the city, and I feel like every stoplight or every block, Gary would point out the window and he'd have a story to tell about that building or that house or that hill or that neighborhood. And what was really great for me personally was that I could look at the city anew through his eyes, because there were stories that I hadn't thought about, and it also wasn't a way I was used to looking at the city. And so when it came time to choose our sites, I'll just use one as an example, the Shipley Street, which was I'll pull that up in a moment, was a really interesting row of buildings that I would have drawn on my own had I come across them. But knowing the story about them gave them a depth that I hadn't known before. And so it gave me a cause, which was basically through Gary's eyes. So Gary, if you want to tell the story of Shipley Street, I'll pull up the image.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Paul and I went driving down south of Market. And as most of you probably know, most of south of Market sits on what used to be either Mission Bay or a big swamp on the shores of Mission Bay. And therefore, when the earthquake hit, the 1906 earthquake, and then also the 1989 earthquake, this was the part of San Francisco that actually suffered the most terrible damage. And there's this extraordinary street that I first heard about, Shipley Street, which is in this fantastic drawing that Paul has done. I first heard about this from a U.S. Geological Survey publication called the Earthquake Subsidence Zone. And it basically listed these streets that sank, where the ground sank during the earthquake. And that was very common. They called it made land. It was landfill, basically. It was reclaimed land. So it sank. This is not a pre-earthquake building. All of those buildings were destroyed by fire and by the destruction of the earthquake itself, the structural destruction. But they built new buildings into this sunk land. And then later the city came along and regraded the streets. And what's happened is this building is half buried by the regraded street. You can see that little funny like locked door on the left. That, that's like a garage door that ought to be 4 feet lower down. So these are literally buried up to their shoulders, and they're just extraordinary. And I asked a young guy coming out of that house, what's it like in there? And he says, well, the interior is completely cattywampus. If I like roll a ball down my hallway, it like rolls off to the side. So it was great, showing it to Paul. And, for just as I think Paul said that, he got to see things through my eyes, seeing all of these often familiar and sometimes unfamiliar sights through Paul's eyes gave me a entirely new vision of them, because he's got such an extraordinarily both, very detailed, but quirky and a little offbeat and sort of mysterious. And so it really added a lot of depth to my feeling about these sites that I wrote about.
And the illustrations really complement the stories too. Like the way you drew it, Paul, makes like the hand is hand drawn. You can sort of feel the how fragile the house is in ways that like a regular photo may not. So, I mean, it's quite a treat to read the stories and then see the way your pictures make the words jump out more. It's really neat. Like, hey, what about Joy Street? Like, it's a street in Nob Hill. I walked by thousands of times, and Gary, what is this? There was some kind of murder action going on. Like, tell us more.
Well, first of all, before I get into the murder, I just, Paul and I, went through the drawings that he had already done and that he was planning to do, and we just, one of the most fun things about our collaboration was deciding, like, what's the order of these going to be for the book? And you always want to open with something really strong and interesting and that really kind of sums up the whole spirit of the book. And we chose Joy Street, and Paul, maybe you want to pull that one up. We chose this because it's this perfect combination of grandeur and sort of mottliness and strangeness, a little bit run down, but also quite magnificent, with that incredible crack in the stairs that Paul has lovingly rendered. And these sort of Spanish style, rather, Rococo looking buildings. And what's extraordinary about this and what gives it its unique quality that made us want to include it is where it is. It's right in the heart of the city. It's half a block from the corner of Powell, just off Pine. So this is like, you can't get any more deep central San Francisco. And, most people are barreling 40 miles an hour at Pine Street, which is the main Western arterial in downtown San Francisco. And they might not even realize that there's like 25-foot wide formal staircase going up for completely no obvious reason. And then it goes up to the top of the hill, and all of a sudden you're on California Street. California and Powell is arguably the most famous storied intersection in all of downtown San Francisco. It's the place that has the manual cable car turnaround. There's all these big hotels. It's really, really ritzy and fancy. And then you drop down in the very next block into Chinatown. So that I think our chapter is called Joy Street, 3 Universes in 3 Blocks, because you just get this, the street is only 3 blocks long, and you get these amazing transformations. And I'll just very quickly tell the story you alluded to. What I try to do in a lot of this book was give a lot of the deep historical context, the really strange historical context. And one thing that a lot of San Franciscans will find hard to imagine is that Nob Hill, right where the Fairmont and the Mark Hopkins now are, was a completely desolate, sandy wasteland. It was like a favela with, like a run down sort of camp made out of ramshackle materials on the top. It was completely desolate and poor. And in fact, it was the reason its desolation resulted in a murderer getting caught and ultimately getting lynched, because he was going from the Mission to North Beach, and to avoid detection, he walked across Nob Hill right near Joyce Street. And there was another crime had been committed up there, and he was just stopped by sort of happenstance. He was very well dressed and he was very well spoken, and he would have gotten away with it. But people said, wait a minute, why are you going over Nob Hill? You must have something to hide if you're up here, crossing over this desolate place. And he was detained, and he was actually, they figured out who he was. His name was James Stewart, and he was actually hanged. So those are the kind of stories that, I tried to dig up to just provide, the fascinating in-depth background of all of the sites that Paul and I dealt with.
Yeah,
I'd like to add there that you asked about how we chose, and I think that's one of the things that makes this book unique, because I had come across Joy Street after 25 years of living in San Francisco. I was actually stuck in traffic and happened to be on right in front of the stairs, stopped in traffic, looked over and thought, where is that? I've never seen that before. I took a reference photo, looked it up on Google, and then went out and walked it and realized that I really want to draw this. And I went to Gary and I said, hey, do you know about Joy Street? And he said, yeah, of course I do. And he starts telling me all these wonderful stories. But would we have thought to put that in the book? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we would have chosen it amongst the many list of sites, but because it sort of started, I brought one thing to his desk, he brought one thing to my desk. And so there's this sort of, Paul's picks, Gary's picks, but then they became collaborative picks because we had to say, yeah, that one works for both of us. So it's a really unique collection of drawings and stories in that way.
Oh yeah, I highly encourage people to buy the book, follow it, like take the book, walk the streets, follow it, read Gary's story, see Paul's drawings, see so you can find the spots. It's actually, once you compare like the spot, what's in the book, what's in real life, it's really fascinating. It's unlike any book you see in history. So, all right, let's go to another one. It's Pier 24. Once upon a time, there was a cheap, fast luxury liner from here to LA. What's up with that?
Yeah, well, this chapter is Paul's drawing is of a magnificent old broken down pier shed on just under the Bay Bridge. As you can obviously see, it's right near the Pier 24 photo gallery. And we wanted to do this a particular site, obviously because of this extraordinary angle on the Bay Bridge. But you can also see, if you look in the center of this drawing, there's an old broken down, decrepit, collapsing railroad track that runs on a siding. Paul and I, when we were scouting this, we actually went out into this building that's actually Pier 26, the building on the right. And when we were out there, we saw some really odd things. There was a woman out sitting in a truck outside sort of a fisherman's storage area, sitting chain smoking cigarettes inside a truck with a seagull sitting in her lap, which is something I've never seen before. But then we found an open, one of those metal doors that you raise up with the chains, and we were able to squeeze under it. And we went outside onto that very railroad track that Paul drew. And when we were out there, we kind of went out to the end of the pier, and both of us almost fell through a large hole that was in the middle of the asphalt beyond that railroad track. It was completely uncovered. I guess we weren't supposed to be there, but it didn't meet OSHA requirements. But it was, that railroad track is part of that gritty, muscular port city history of the Embarcadero. And it's really easy to forget now that the Embarcadero is this beautiful urban promenade. It's got the farmers market. It's got luxury hotels. It's lovely. But for most of its history, and especially before the bridges were built, this was San Francisco's front door. This was where all the work of the city happened. This is where the ships that were the lifeblood of San Francisco's economy docked at an astonishing rate. This is where longshoremen who were like incredibly hardworking, very dangerous job. The bars and cheap cafes on the Embarcadero were filled with men missing fingers and arms. A lot of people got killed, and they were lifting incredibly heavy. It was called break bulk cargo. This is long before they had container ships. So everybody was working with cranes and bales that were being manhandled. And one of the most romantic and lovely things that we've lost of the many things that we've lost on that Embarcadero was the robust, coastwise luxury liners that would run very fast and very inexpensively between San Francisco and Los Angeles. So you could, at 6 o'clock at night, you could get on a big luxury liner right near where our picture is, have a really sumptuous meal with like 6 meat courses, a big buffet, have a drink, And after dinner, you could dance to an orchestra. Then you'd retire to your stateroom, look at the ocean going by, and at 10 in the morning, you would arrive in Los Angeles, where, so, and this would cost not, even, it was competitive in both time and in cost to taking the train. So this is something. It's sad. I mean, the economics of running ocean liners don't allow this to happen anymore. But it was a fantastic era in San Francisco. One of the great things about the waterfront.
I mean, if it ever comes back, I'll do it. I'll take it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But so if someone, what are some of the landmarks that still, if I want to see what it was like in the 1930s, what are some of the landmarks around that if I go today, I can still that'll be like, wow, it was around when George DiMaggio was in that town.
Yeah. Well, the most obvious one, I mean, all of these pier fronts that Paul drew in this drawing that extend both to the north and the south of the ferry building, they all go back to this great era. Most of them were built in after the earthquake in the 1910s and 20s. There was a big movement to beautify the Embarcadero and make it more elegant. And they used two different architectural styles, a different one north of the ferry building, which is neoclassic, and it was modeled on the Chelsea piers. And on the south, they used a Mission Revival style, which was actually associated with the Southern Pacific Railroad. You can't really see it because Paul's drawing is not showing the front of the pier ends, but people probably, especially north of the ferry building, they're very striking with those big kind of carved blocks. They kind of look classical. So those really magnificent pier buildings are a link with that past. But the most dramatic link is the ferry building itself. That ferry building has stood there in various, it had a different shape before the earthquake, but it's actually, it was that very building of the earthquake. It was about the 1880s when that was built. But so that's got a real link with, and there's Paul is pulling it up, and it was modeled after the Giralda, the cathedral in the tower in Sevilla, Spain, on beautiful building. And that the huge ferry building itself, besides the tower, that is where thousands and tens of thousands of commuters came into San Francisco every day, every work day, every work week. It was actually the second biggest transportation hub in the world after London's Charing Cross Station. So as it turns out, that a lot of the things, and this is you can see to the left that on Paul's drawings there, those are those pier fronts that are neoclassical. You can see them. They're kind of got a big, archways and triangular pediment above them. So those are all part of this muscular era of when the port was bustling and extremely noisy. And there are certain things that we don't see anymore, but there's remnants of them. You'll see railroad tracks running along, especially at sort of the base of Telegraph Hill on some of the streets like Green and Sansom and Battery streets. And that was the old Beltline Railroad, which right up into the 50s and 60s was clanking and smashing away at the base of Telegraph Hill. So that was a unique little railroad that basically served a very short area of the port. And so there were so many remarkable and, gritty and muscular and dirty, but, really glorious in the sense of that they were so utterly unpretentious and they were just completely functional. And even when I was a kid in the 60s, I went down and remember seeing longshoremen unloading bales from a freighter. That was the very end of that era, because already, I think the first container ship came in 1959, but they were still doing some of that old longshoreman work into the 60s. But so a lot of that era is actually physically preserved more than any other American city's waterfront, actually. So you can't see the actual functionality of the old waterfront, but you can still see some of the remnants of it.
Yeah. Hey, what, like on the cover of the book, I don't know if folks can see it, but I think it's Calhoun Street. And then you can also see a little bit of the pier that you talked about. Like, what's the relation to Calhoun, this street, and the pier? That's on the cover of the book.
Well, I mean, there's no particular relation, except that this Calhoun Terrace, as it's called, is, on the very sort of sheer eastern edge of Telegraph Hill. And there are some great stories about longshoremen who used to live on Calhoun and on nearby streets, and they'd walk to work. So that they, hard as it is to believe now, Telegraph Hill was not always, an extremely expensive neighborhood. In fact, it was a very poor neighborhood, and people like longshoremen would, be living there, and they could recognize the ship that they were going to work on by the sound of its whistle. So, there's stories about, the longshoremen living on Alta or Calhoun or Upper Montgomery Street would wander down from their house, their ramshackle cold water flat with a single burner stove, and walk down those rickety steps like the Filbert and Greenwich steps and go to work at the base of the hill and go to work in those piers.
So Telegraph Hill, where now investment bankers and tech workers live, used to be a poor working class neighborhood.
Yeah. I mean, all of the hills of San Francisco, with the exception, the first, there was one hill that was rich at the beginning. That was Rincon Hill, which is now barely exists because the Bay Bridge sits on it. But in the early days, especially, it was so hard to get up those hills, and before the cable car was invented, that rich people didn't tend to, even though they had the views, they didn't live there. So that, that all radically changed. And Telegraph Hill in particular was part of a impoverished Italian and Irish neighborhood. And North Beach was a bad, hoodlum-filled neighborhood in the eyes of much of San Francisco, filled with tenements and, impoverished people with large families living in falling apart shacks. So that, and the Mission as well was like that. So all of these neighborhoods that are now, quite, at least many parts of them are quite posh, were far from that in the earliest days. And in the case of Telegraph Hill, until the 1930s. It wasn't really until the 1930s that Telegraph Hill, you get these headlines that are hilarious. Like the New York Times ran a headline, San Francisco's historic Bohemian Quarter succumbs to forces of progress. And this basically headline has run every month, every year in San Francisco since time began. I think that one ran in about 1932. So this is a very, very old story.
Yeah,
Paul is showing this is another fantastic. Paul, why don't you talk about this drawing?
Oh, well, you were talking about Telegraph Hill, so
Yeah.
I thought I'd bring this up. But the interesting thing, what I like about this drawing is that it tackles a very iconic scene. I'm drawing Coy Tower, I'm drawing Chinatown, but it's done from the Tin Hau Temple, which is is it the oldest Buddhist temple, Gary?
No, Taoist.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, it's
Taoist
temple on the West Coast, or is it in the U.S.?
No, I think it's on the West Coast.
It's on the West Coast.
But it may be the US. Yeah.
Yeah. So one or the other, but it was destroyed in the quake and then rebuilt. And I was working on this drawing when Gary came to my studio. And one of the really interesting things for me was, I was drawing the architecture as I saw it, because I went to the temple and stood out on their fire escape and did my preliminary drawings. But Gary walked over and he started pointing out the architecture here to the left, and he was saying, that's not the original architecture, and it's also not true to how it would have been built at the time, because when it was rebuilt, and Gary, you can correct me and tell this better than I, but that it was built so that it looked more aesthetically Asian. And that these are more decorative than they are actual structural. And you know, as somebody who observes the city and literally draws what he sees, to understand this element of it was immediately a new depth. And so you know, there were many things going on in this drawing for me. One, understanding that level of history, and then two, also attempting to render something that people have taken hundreds and thousands of photos of, and literally come to San Francisco to visit. And so my challenge was, how do I bring some new life to it, which was to combine these two worlds.
Yeah, that's an amazing drawing. And I think, you know, most people have probably not seen that particular angle on Coit Tower across, you know, this is looking down, I think that's Clay Street in Chinatown with some of this fantastic post-earthquake Chinese architecture. And yeah, Paul, as Paul mentioned, essentially the fascinating thing about Chinatown's architecture is that it's a stage set. It's a stage set to look Chinese. And it was, these buildings were executed by white architects, but at the behest of the Chinese merchants who owned the buildings after Chinatown was completely destroyed in the fire. And basically it was like an image makeover. And it made Chinatown more tourist friendly. It made it more exotic. It made it more like Disneyland. Before the earthquake, Chinatown was fairly drab, and it didn't have all of these Chinese architectural motifs. So as Paul mentioned, what's fascinating about these motifs is that in traditional Chinese architecture, these would all have structural functions. But in Chinatown, they're basically just add-ons. They don't have any structural function. And so it's, you know, it's a Potemkin village, if you will. But it's what's fascinating about it for me is that it's been around for so long that it's acquired a kind of its own integrity. I mean, it's been there now. A lot of these buildings are there since 1908. I can remember once standing outside the Li Po bar about 40 years ago and looking at it and going, gee, is this Chinese or is this quote Chinese? And the truth is at this point, it's kind of both, you know, and that's sort of wonderful that, you know, you do something that's in a way fake, but if it's around long enough, it gets a kind of second order reality, and it's lovely. And Chinatown is a beautiful, and it does, you know, it has that great combination of feeling exotic, if you will, you know, feeling sort of otherworldly. And then of course it's, you know, this, in a certain way, you could see it as a very high functioning slum, but it's high functioning, and it's very useful for both for the older Chinese who are sort of, you know, aging in place in Chinatown, and for immigrants who will come in, live in the SROs that still dominate a lot of the housing in Chinatown. There's not great quarters, but they pay low rent. And it's a system that kind of works. And there's a reason that the city has not tried to fix Chinatown, because if they were to fix Chinatown, you would end up displacing a lot of folks who don't have a lot of money. And with housing costs running at $800,000 a unit, there would never be any way to replace it. So that one of the things I find fascinating about Chinatown is that it's kind of Potemkin village quality. You can actually look at it and admire it sincerely as a functioning, you know, functioning, unique cityscape. And I think Paul's drawing really captures some of the really remarkable qualities of it.
It's, I mean, the Joyce, Chinatown, Telegraph Hill, if you think about it, are really not that far away from each other. I mean, you can walk it in like within an hour.
Oh, yeah. I mean, as I say, Joyce Street literally runs right into Chinatown. And Joyce Street, you know, it crosses the Cameron House, which is where Donaldina Cameron, you know, a missionary, you know, fought this heroic fight against the terrible evil of sex slavery. So that all of these neighborhoods, especially in the northeast part of San Francisco, they just run on top of each other. And I think that proximity and that the fact that these universes collide so quickly is something that's really exciting for both Paul and me. And I think we're both, it's kind of, we share that sensibility of being drawn to kind of no man's lands and places where things, you know, change into each other in a really rapid and unexpected way. And that's kind of a quintessential urban thing. And, you know, this is one of the things interesting about this book, is that in Paul's earlier work, you know, he really didn't focus on the famous at all. And Paul, maybe you can talk about, you know, the difference between that and then, you know, what we did in this book.
Yeah, thank you. Because yeah, for Oliver Coffey, absolutely, Gary's right. The joke I used to have is, you know, if I saw a group of people taking pictures in one direction, I'd turn around and draw whatever was behind them, because, you know, San Francisco in a way is almost too easy to find beauty. It's not necessarily easy to render or to capture that beauty, but there are so many wonderful vistas and so much beautiful architecture. But you know, and that is can be a challenge for an artist, because an audience brings their own personal relationship to that beauty, and sort of extreme beauty also then overshadows other elements, such as just you know, compositional elements or formal elements. And there's more challenge in a way to taking what is not obviously beautiful and showing what's beautiful about that. And both Gary and I share this too, is, you know, I'm a huge walker. I've walked a lot of the city, and of course, Cool Gray City, you know, is all about that. But for me, I would go out walking in early in the day or late in the day when the sun was low and giving like long, beautiful shadows. And I just looked for gorgeous compositions. And sometimes if the building was too beautiful, I wouldn't draw that. I'd go on to the next thing, because I wanted to show the San Francisco that was the sort of in-between moments, and just a beautiful way that a shadow fell across the clapboard, or just the way the wires sort of created these crisscross compositions in the sky from one building to another. And so, you know, that sort of became one of my motifs. But, you know, Spirits was a new project, and I intentionally wanted to tackle the subject of iconic sites. And so that became my next challenge, was not so much, you know, how to render them, but how do I present them in a way that is new to people? And that was partly where I needed to see the city through new eyes, and where Gary allowed me to see the city through new eyes. And I think Joy Street is a great example of that. I think the drawing I just showed of Telegraph Hill from the Temple, there's another one I want to show, which is Lombard Street. And I was working on this when, as well, when Gary came to the studio. And this was actually a drawing I was making as a gift for a very good friend who helped my wife and I buy our house. And I told her that she could have anything, I would draw anything she wanted in the city as a gift. And she sort of, you know, embarrassingly said, I'm so sorry, Paul, but I love Lombard Street. I've always loved Lombard. And I said, absolutely, I'll do that for you. And in a way, it was another gift that she gave me, because I might have, you know, hemmed and hawed and put that off for a long time, because it is so iconic. I mean, is there any other street in San Francisco that has more people taking photographs and more tourists on it than, and on a daily, like moment to moment level, than Lombard Street? In fact, if you've been out there are people, city employees, or maybe they're volunteers, but they're wearing bright yellow vests, and their whole job is to keep people from standing in the street, because cars actually still drive down it, and everybody just wants to get into the middle of the street and take photographs. So all they do all day long is tell people, get back on the sidewalk. And so here I am, and what I cut out was the hundreds of people who are literally flowing by me as like a river of tourists. And I needed to find a way to render this street differently than every one of those tourists were taking a photo. And so I just really focused on the quintessential element of it, which was it curves. It's a curvy street. And so I took this sort of fisheye lens on it. And I had this drawing on my board, and I hadn't written a story for it. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, because it was going to be a gift. But when Gary came in, he responded so vibrantly to the take that I had on it. I think in a way it spawned our conversation of how do we look at the city differently, literally figuratively, historically, and that's what I like, how there's sort of this back and forth. Again, how did we choose these sites? Well, in a way, the site started because I was making a gift. I needed to be able to see the city differently. I was challenging myself. I didn't want to just make a rote drawing, or, you know, if I'm going to put my hand to paper, you know, I want to do the best job I can with it. And then it created this back and forth between Gary and I, and it created sort of philosophical tone of how we approached not just each site, but the entire book. How do we give San Francisco something different, of all the people who love the city and know a lot about it, you know, because you have to assume your audience is educated, and you write for them and you draw for them. And so that was a great deal of fun for me, because I got to turn around and face the same direction as all the people taking pictures.
Oh, wow.
And that was so fantastic for me, because this was when Paul and I we met to, he said, hey, let's talk about a possible collaboration. And, you know, Paul and I first met because I wanted him to illustrate Cool Gray City of Love. And we reached out to him, but, you know, the subtitle of that is 49 Views of San Francisco. And as our viewers can probably tell, Paul's drawings are quite labor intensive. And the deadline was, I don't know what it was probably 6 weeks or 8 weeks or something. That was not going to work for Paul to do 49 drawings of San Francisco. So we weren't able to work, but we met at the Northern California Book Awards. We were both receiving an award from them. And, you know, we hit it off immediately, and we just said, hey, we're going to work together someday. We don't know how, but we're going to figure it out. And so Paul called me into his studio, and this Lombard Street drawing is like 4 by 5 feet. I mean, this thing is mind blowing. It's enormous. And I just, you know, walked in and saw it, and it was like, oh my God, I've probably seen 10,000 images of Lombard Street, but I've never seen one from this ant on acid perspective. You know, this is like totally unique perspective. And it was just this exciting thing, because it just confirmed, like, this is the way I want to write about the city, to kind of defamiliarize you, to make you fall in love with it, to shock you even, just to, you know, bring everything that is, you know, activate the neurons in your brain about these really, really, really well-trodden places that it's hard to get any creative thoughts about. And that drawing so obviously did that it was really exciting for me to pursue digging up the stories about all these sites and to embark on this collaboration. So that was a really great sort of introduction to our collaboration, was seeing that drawing in Paul's studio on Potrero Avenue.
Yeah. Hey, everyone, if you have a question, please type it into the chat section, and we'll get to them soon. I do have one more question for you two. In the book, in the beginning of the book, you two effectively drew a love story for a love letter for San Francisco during the pandemic. Like, Paul, you wrote a great piece on it, and I'm sorry, Gary wrote a great piece on it, and Paul, you had this drawing that just captured the sentiment at the moment. Let's, you know, 6 months from now, a year from now, we have COVID under control. San Francisco is bouncing back. If at that time you were to collaborate again, write another essay, do an illustration to capture the Phoenix-like Renaissance of San Francisco, what story, Gary, what story would you tell? Paul, what would the image for you would capture that Renaissance?
Paul, do you want to take that first?
All right, I'll take that first. I'll start by showing the drawing I did for this new introduction, and talk about it for a moment, which is, you know, we were finishing up the book, going to production earlier in this year, shortly after lockdown happened, and that, you know, we all were realizing that this pandemic was for real, and it wasn't something that was going to go away in 10 days. And Gary had the brilliant idea to include a new introduction, which talked about, you know, we are literally putting this book to print, sending this book to print during a pandemic, and asked if I wanted to do an accompanying drawing. And he and I had both talked a lot about how the city felt so different, and in some ways was very, open to flaneurs like us, where now there weren't as many cars or people around, but how it was a bit of a ghost town, and that it, some of the soul, some of the energy, some of what we knew, what we identified with as San Francisco, how absent that was. And and I wanted to do a drawing that just sort of commemorated the moment, because it's I was thinking a lot about the idea of doing a book of history. Gary was researching these stories, but all of my drawings were essentially contemporary. I take out people, I take out cars, and a lot of times, the only things that you can really identify an era from my drawings are, say, the wires, because there's a period where there weren't wires, and there will be a period after this where there aren't any. But otherwise, the architecture is whatever age the architecture is. But I thought, Gary's reading these books that over the past 100 years or whatever, however many references he's using. And what about the people who are going to be using our book as a reference 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now? And we were essentially creating an historic moment that we were unable to reflect on. And that's kind of the interesting thing about history for me, is that a lot of times we're reading the stories from people who don't know what tomorrow is. And we have the benefit of hindsight. And so there was sort of this passing of the baton that I felt like we were doing by giving a snapshot of today, our today, earlier this year, and passing that on for the readers from now who can relate to it, and the readers of the future. And to answer your question, I honestly don't know what I would do, because we're not there. And that's sort of why I wanted to tell that, why I think it's so poignant to do something that symbolizes this moment, is because often our reflections on the moment are because we don't know what tomorrow is. It's not just our reflection on how we feel today, it's about how we feel about the chaos and the unknown that lies before us. So I think it would be about literally going out and seeing what is new. What's it look like when we take those boards down off the windows? That's what I would draw next. And that's sort of like the hope and excitement, is like, I can't wait to find what I would draw next, because I literally don't know.
Wow. Yuri?
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably have to echo what Paul says. It's something that you don't know until you're there. But I think in a way, when I was thinking about your question, the obvious response would be I would tell a bunch of stories that are all have to do with the reawakening and reopening of the human San Francisco, of crowds, of people in the Cafe Trieste, of people in Union Square, of people lined up at the Powell Street cable car line, the cable cars running, all of that. And that's, that would obviously be the big obvious thing of what it's going to be like, of people in bars, people in restaurants, people visiting each other's houses. But, often you tell those stories more eloquently through a little bit of indirection. And maybe a story might still be a kind of a deserted place, a place without just crowds of people, but where, this is almost a visual thing, but almost in the corner of the story, if you will, is something that shows the awakened city. But there's still this quality of silence and perhaps even emptiness, but with this beautiful contrast that maybe isn't really in your face. So, I'm kind of winging it, but you often tell the most effective stories not by telling the most obvious ones, but it would certainly have to reflect coming back to life and people being together, because that's what it's all about, and that's what everybody has missed so terribly. And all the wonderful institutions and businesses and theaters and artistic groups and music and all of that surviving and being celebrated and being participated in, that would have to be part of the story. And how it's told, that remains to be seen. But that will be the story on that happy day when that happens.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, gentlemen, so much. And we do have some questions. From JP, he is asking, what is each of your favorite historical SF building and why?
Oh, wow. Paul, do you want to go first?
Does anybody else hear that? Oh, okay. Sorry, there was a weird sound going on. I don't know if anybody heard it. I'm sorry, ask that again because there was a sound that was echoing on my computer for a moment.
What is each of your favorite historical San Francisco building and why?
Oh, historical building. It's funny. I don't think in terms of history. I often think of maybe style of building or neighborhood. I'm terrible at the favorite questions because I don't know that I have a favorite, but I'll tell you something that I love, which is I lived in the Mission for 10 years, and I lived on Guerrero Street at 15th, and those sort of blocks like along Guerrero 15th to, let's say, maybe more like 14th to 20th. There's this sort of in and out type of work that goes on. Like if you're walking down the sidewalk, there's a building and it has its frontage, but then it has a side like it's like one person wide to go down to a door that is like halfway behind the building or halfway back in the building, and then right next to it is the other building. And so what it creates is this sort of like puzzle piece effect. And if you're walking along, it feels like the light sort of falls in and it creates a shadow, and then it's stark on the surface, and it gives this sort of light, dark. And I love the way that feels, because if it contrasts that to walking, say, like down south of Market, where the blocks are twice as wide as neighborhood blocks, and you'll have maybe a large cement building or something, and the frontage just makes you feel tired. Like it feels like it took me a half an hour to get to the end of the block. Whereas when you're in a neighborhood like that area of the Mission, every moment is it's invigorating, and it's alive, and it feels like it's a really human type of environment. Whereas bigger, more cement structures tend to be less so. So I really respond to the city in that way.
Boy, there's so many I could choose. I love Mission Dolores. I mean, that's kind of the granddaddy historically of the buildings of San Francisco. It's along with a little piece of the Presidio Officers Club, it's the oldest structure in San Francisco. And it's a magnificent, gorgeous church. I love the cemetery next to it too, almost more than the building itself. Another one that's completely different, and then I'll stop, is the streamlined modern maritime museum that looks like a ship at Aquatic Park. I just find that so playful and joyous, and it's like something out of a Noel Coward and P.G. Wodehouse musical. You expect to see gentlemen in tuxedos and ladies in cocktail dresses, stepping out on the deck and looking out over the waves. It's just a wonderful building. So
you can go there for weddings, I think.
I guess you probably can.
Yeah.
Right?
Hey, Gary, question for you. It's about the battery, actually. Have you covered the story of the battery in the building? And Paul, do you have any drawings of the building itself?
No, I've never done any research into the building of the battery itself. No, sorry.
Yeah, and I don't have any drawings of it. I've of course been inside, and I'd almost want to do the interior of it. There's so many wonderful rooms inside the battery.
I think Colleen can make that work. And Colleen, I think there's a short snippet in one of the Battery magazine that talks about the history, like the first few episodes, like issue or something. If that whoever asked the question really want to look into it, it's someone looked into it, Steve. So ask Colleen, maybe she can help you find that issue. And Paul, the question for you: do you have any? Actually, for both of you, do you have any stories and drawings of the earthquake cottages?
I don't believe I have any drawings. No, Gary, I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of stories.
Yeah, they're scattered throughout town. There's one that's actually on display in the Presidio, but I have some. I discuss them some in this book. There were 5,610 of them built, and they were really expressly built for poor San Franciscans, really to keep them out of the rain. And the intention was to keep them in San Francisco, like keep them from leaving town, keep a laboring class in San Francisco. So they were, they were quite enlightened for their day to create this sort of social housing. And there were a bunch of them that were found. A whole lot of them were, in these big camps. And then when after 1908 or so, they got moved all over town. Most of them now, the more than anywhere else, they're found in Bernal Heights for some reason. I guess that shows the good taste of Bernal Heights. And most of them are incorporated into other structures. So it's not like you'll just find one sitting on the street. They're kind of often have been, built over or built around. But they're fascinating remnants. And I think there's something like 24 of them that are still extant in San Francisco.
Yeah, check out the Western Neighborhood Project. They have a story about how they saved some earthquake cottages and moved it to the Presidio, actually.
Oh yeah, no,
it's sitting right there across from the main quad, I believe.
Right. Yeah. That Western Neighborhood Project is a terrific resource. Absolutely.
And hey, question about the Sentinel Building in North Beach. Can anyone tell us more about that?
Well, I mean, I don't know too much about it. That's now the Coppola building. I'm pretty sure, unless I'm wrong, it's a Flatiron. So it's the same design as the Flatiron buildings of New York City. And it's, it's a magnificent building. My good friend and former and the founder of Salon, David Talbot, who author of Season of the Witch, had an office in that building for many years. So it's delightfully old fashioned, with its kind of iron stairs and, and then if it has that cafe, and down below Coppola actually has a little screening room. So it's a beautiful building with all kinds of nooks and crannies in it. But I don't know too much about its history other than that.
Oh, wow. Hey, folks, we're coming up against it. So let me just few final comments. Paul, there's so many questions, comments about how lovely and how quirky, how wonderful your drawings are. Like, where could people get, like, are these prints, separate prints folks can buy?
Sure. I sell both the original drawings as well as reproductions, which there's a link on my site, which is paulmadonna.com, to my store site, which has a lot of originals and prints, which you can order directly from there. If there's something that you're interested in of mine, you can just email me if you don't see it there. Yeah, it's hopefully pretty easy. paulmadonna.com.
Fantastic. And Gary, tell us where we can get this book.
Oh, well, you can get it at the bookstore of your choice. Paul and I both encourage everyone to support your local brick and mortar bookstores, especially during always, but during the pandemic, it's very easy. And sure, if you have to buy something on Amazon, you got to do it. But we have to preserve our whatever your favorite local bookstore is, whether it's in North Beach City Lights or the Booksmith or West Portal Books or Green Apple Books, what have you. We definitely encourage all of those bookstores and others do carry it. So absolutely. And you can, I'll get information on my website, GaryKamiya.com, about that. And I also offer walking tours if anyone's interested in signing up for those.
And, when do your articles come out?
And my articles, so I also write a history column for the San Francisco Chronicle that's called Portals of the Past. And that runs every other Saturday. So there's one coming up this Saturday, which is actually one of the buildings that Paul and I had to leave on the cutting room floor. So if you want to see the story of a building that we weren't able to get into the book, it's in this Saturday's Chronicle.
All right, everyone, support your local bookstore, buy the book, buy some prints, buy a copy of the Chronicle. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Colleen, I believe you'll be following up with some of the websites and links to to both Gary and Paul's respective websites. So if folks want more information, they can certainly go there, right?
Absolutely. So we'll send an email with the recording from tonight, along with links to Paul's store and a link to buy the book. And just a reminder, if you order it from Booksmith, you can get a signed copy from them. So we'll put all that information in the email, and feel free to share this with your friends and family.
All right. Hey, Colleen,
Thanks,
thanks for coordinating this whole thing. Gary, Paul, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your passions. Much appreciated. And with that, good night, folks. Have a great evening.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
And
Good night.
good night. Thanks,
Thank you.
Battery.
Bye-bye.